The Vietnamese Soldier Experience. In 1945, right after being crushed by Germany in World War II, France was looking to claim some of its old colonies in Asia in hope of regaining some power. They went into Vietnam expecting it to be an easy run, figuring that they had the upper hand, and in this case, more money and better weapons, than some silly little rice farmers. They were wrong. Anti-imperialists and communists rebelled against the French-controlled government, and when the Soviet Union and Communist China began to supply the revolutionaries with weapons and money, the struggle became a war. This is a picture of French airplanes dropping French soldiers over a field in Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And guess who won? Here we see triumphant Vietnamese soldiers raising their flag at Dien Bien Phu. Those Frenchies had underestimated the power of nationalism. And so the French surrendered. Leaders met here at the Geneva Conference to decide what to do with Vietnam. After much debate, they came to the conclusion that the country should be split into North and South Vietnam. The North being controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party, and the South controlled by President Diem and the non-communists. An election for the Vietnamese people was scheduled so that the country could be reunited under a government of their own choosing. But it never happened. Diem, who renounced his position as a puppet for the American government, refused to hold an election. He did this following Noel he would lose to Ho Chi Minh because of his lack of popularity for repressing the Vietnamese so badly that many turned to communism in hope of freedom. This also got him assassinated in 1963. As a result, revolutionary groups reformed and began the struggle for national independence all over again. And then the United States got involved. The American government joined the Vietnam War to uphold its containment policy on communism, believing that it was too risky to let this small country fall under China and the USSR. Yet, the U.S. government had forgotten that about 200 years ago, their founding fathers had fought for independence, just like these incredibly willful Vietnamese revolutionaries, such as the Viet Cong, whose flag is depicted here. They were a major revolutionary force composed of small, guerrilla-type groups that maintained civilian profiles, blending in with their background. They were the farmers and peasants that could not leave to join the military. In a written statement of goals, the Viet Cong wanted to overthrow the camouflaged colonial regime of the American imperialists and the dictatorial power of Diem, servant of the Americans, and institute a government of national democratic union, to implement agrarian reform with the aim of providing land to the tiller, and to develop a national and democratic culture and education. The Americans struck with a huge amount of force, having more deadly and advanced military technology. The Viet Cong did surprisingly well with much lighter weapons than what they were targeted with, outlasting carpet bombing, napalm, Agent Orange, and heavy artillery. The Viet Cong would attack military bases and outposts, government buildings, and then defend their small villages from American attacks. Because the Viet Cong can only be picked out during combat, the Americans often used search-and-destroy methods to round up entire villages for interrogation, searching for suspicious material, and extermination. The Viet Cong did not receive the same kind of financial support from China and the USSR as the professional army did, and they had to rely mostly on incredible camouflage techniques, homemade booby traps, recycled American bomb duds, and most famously, their underground tunnel system. The American military may have had the upper hand when it came to money and weapons, but what they lacked was familiarity with the land and how to use it to their advantage, as the Vietnamese had. These tunnels stretched for miles underneath the hard red clay soil, several feet under the surface, where they would train and live with their families during the day and come out at night, sometimes staying underground for months at a time, undetected. Women were a significant aspect of the war for the Vietnamese, though they did not get much attention for it. Many were valuable spies, messengers on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, militia and guerrilla soldiers, and, of course, nurses. The Vietnamese demonstrated the strength of their will many times over, like the way they did at the Battle of Epoch in 1963. It was a skirmish over a small hamlet outside the city of Saigon, but the Viet Cong showed the Americans that despite their lack of heavy artillery and fewer numbers, that they could do damage. Just look at the remnants of the American plane in the picture. January 31st, 1968, the Tet Offensive was the Viet Cong's most famous feat. It is known as a turning point in the Vietnam War, where Viet Cong and the NVA almost simultaneously took over many cities and towns in South Vietnam, most notably the capital Saigon. Both Vietnamese groups suffered heavy losses with the all-out effort they put into seizing government buildings. Unfortunately, the South Vietnamese and the Americans regained the captured cities throughout the next several weeks. Vietnamese communists did not feel like they had suffered a total defeat. In fact, they believed their efforts had contradicted the popular American belief that Vietnam was weak. With the Viet Cong's numbers dwindled down to almost nothing after the Tet Offensive, it was up to the North Vietnamese army to take over the majority of the fighting. They were not about to submit to imperialism anytime soon, no matter how many lives were lost. And here on their flag, the Vietnamese phrase translates to "determined to win." They were the professional, organized army of North Vietnam, made up of trained soldiers supported by the communist governments of Russia and China. They had the ability to stand against the Americans, with a larger variety of guns as well as tanks and airplanes to counterattack the Americans with. The NVA relied heavily upon China and the USSR for equipment, and even then there was a shortage of ammunition. They relied more on the desire for independence rather than bullets. President Nixon decided that the U.S. had been fighting a losing battle for quite some time, protested unrelentlessly by the U.S. citizens. These casualties and expenses were too much for the U.S., who had boasted at the beginning of the war that they were fighting to win. But they had finally accepted that they were not ever going to win. In the Paris Peace Accords of 1973, Article 1 states that the United States and all other countries respect the independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Vietnam as recognized by the 1954 Geneva Agreements on Vietnam. The war did not officially end until April 30th, 1975, when Saigon was captured by the North Vietnamese Army. Government officials surrendered, knowing full well that they would not last with a drastically reduced military aid from the U.S. And here we see American soldiers heading on their way home, finally. Though the Vietnamese had succeeded in kicking out the Americans and subduing opposing South Vietnam, physically reuniting the country, the losses weighed heavily upon the ruined countryside. With the deaths of almost 3 million soldiers and civilians, thousands of Vietnamese remain severely crippled from toxins and explosions. The government continues to be corrupted with extremism. Even today, Vietnam is still suffering from the contaminated countrysides, showing up in high numbers of birth defects and cancers. John Kerry writes in the statement for the Vietnam Veterans Against War, "We found that not only was it a civil war, an effort by a people who had for years been seeking their liberation from any colonial influence, but we also found that the Vietnamese, whom we had enthusiastically molded, were hard put to take up the fight against the threat we were supposedly saving them from. We found most people didn't even know the difference between communism and democracy. They only wanted to work in rice paddies without helicopters flying over them, and napalm burning their villages and tearing their country apart. They wanted Americans to leave them alone in peace. They would practice this art of survival by siding with whichever military force was present, be it Viet Cong, North Vietnamese, or American."